Hello and welcome to this final episode of our NIO Swift MUD tutorial series, where we're creating a multi-user dungeon game using the Swift programming language and the NIO framework. And this episode is really here to wrap things up. So we're going to discuss where you can go from here, based on the framework we set up. But also I want to implement a quick few bug fixes, perhaps a little feature. And finally, I want to discuss possible options for a sort of follow-up series. So let's start. Let's discuss the framework that we created. So I think we have a pretty flexible framework at this time. We're adding additional words and commands. The parser understands, uses the same steps each time. Create a new verb. Make sure that you know how many words the verb requires in a sentence. Make sure that you can create a verb based on the words that were sent in. Then create a helper function that will perform the game logic for the verb and for the command, and finally implement them into the create MUD response function of a parse handler that sort of glues both together. So it glues the command that you get in to the function that creates the business logic. There's also very little that you need to change about the server or the framework itself. So we're not really touching the response handler to add additional verbs, or the way sessions are stored or sessions are handled. That's mostly all stable. So it's just adding content, and I think that's a really good place to be in at this time. Of course, it's possible that at some point in time you will add stuff also to these handlers. For instance, we had to add stuff to allow notifications, or perhaps you want to do more concerning formatting of the messages. But for the most part, it's a pretty flexible system. And to see really how flexible it is, let's try and quench a few bugs. So the first bug I want to discuss is the whispering to other players. So we created a whisper message to target player name, and what this does is it tries and finds the target player based on what you typed in the command. So if you type the command like whisper player name, the player name is matched to a player name somewhere in a user storage. The problem with this, I think, is that this is case sensitive, and I really think that player names or usernames should be case insensitive, because otherwise you'll get the situation where a player say somebody created a username with some strange capitalization, and then other players would have to copy that letter for letter, case by case, and I think that's not a very good user experience. And I also think most people expect usernames to be case insensitive. So to do that, what we're going to do is we're going to make these uppercased and match on the uppercase name. And I think this is enough to make sure that the whisper function became case insensitive. I think it's also a good idea that when we create our user, we check whether the user name is already taken. I think we should make sure that the this too is case insensitive. Otherwise, people will be allowed to create a user or create a player called foo and create player foo, and these will be two different players, and if they happen to be in the same room, you can't decide who to whisper to. So I think these two should be case insensitive. And I think we should do a quick test. So we'll build and run. And we need a terminal. So I think we had a user called let's just create a few test user. And now let's see whether this became case insensitive. So if we have now try and create a test user one without the upper U, we'll get a username already taken. I think this also means that we should make sure that logging in is still case sensitive. So that's and then I think that's very good. I think we can fix this by. Oh no, this uses the same method underwater. So if I close and I log in using test user one full. Let's see. This is getting a bit more complicated than expected because we're sending in the password hash and we need to make this one case insensitive as well. So we'll just make sure that we're sending in uppercase everywhere. Let's run again. So we'll create a new user. Okay, let's try and log in using test user 3. And this now also works. So now let's see if we have a second window. And perhaps we can whisper. However, we still need to get them in the same room. That's the next thing I want to fix. What I really don't like is that to get players into the first room, we need to open a text editor at this time and just hard code the first room where you want to play in that, and it means your players can't just start playing once they create a room. So what I think we should do is this. I think we should create a static variable or static constant called starter room ID, and we'll create it as a UUID based on a string. And then I need to copy this one from somewhere just to be sure that, and let's see, I get the correct formatting. Otherwise I can just copy paste this one, and what I want to do is I want to transform this into a sequence of zeros. And this is what we'll use as the starter room. So all we now need to do is make sure that our JSON file that contains the rooms, and it should be somewhere here. So I will open this folder and I will use the Visual Studio Code to open it. So we have our very first room, and we'll change this one to use the new string. And now we should be able to cd into this one. And I want to get rid of all the old users to start with a sort of clean slate. And now in our MUD helper functions, when we create a user, our new user will be this. And we create a user here. What if we also passed in a current room ID? It's not required. So it's optional. That will give the option of setting a room ID. And now we can go back to our MUD helper functions, and when we're creating views, so we can use a current room ID, and we'll use room.starter room ID. And where's our starter room? I think this one should be forced unwrapped, because this always works. I mean, we're absolutely sure what we're sending here in this code. So that way this no longer is an optional. Okay. So I think that if we start running now, and we'll telnet into our system, and we create a user test user 1, we should be in the first room. Okay, this also means that we can now easily create a second test user, and the user will be created in the same room. So we'll create a user test user 2, and now we should be able to whisper to test user 1. But also, and this is where we started, what if we do it in all caps? Should still work. Okay, cool. So I think these two are now fixed. There's one quick bug I want to fix as well. I noticed when I tried running this code on my Raspberry Pi to have it as a sort of a server in-house, it doesn't work correctly. One way to fix it is, and that's because of the way hosts are bound and then accessible from outside systems. So I was able to, locally it works, but when I want to telnet into the Raspberry Pi, it gets blocked. There are a couple of ways of solving this. I think the cleanest one would be to use environment variables to make this configurable. So we now have hard-coded our username. I think we should make this dependent on an environment variable. And we'll create our own environment variable called NIO Swift MUD hostname. And by default, if it's not set, we can still use this one. And for our port, we'll do the same thing. We'll have an integer process info environment NIO Swift MUD port, and by default we'll default to the string value of 8888, and for some reason we can't transform it into an int. We'll just default to 8888 as well. So now we should be able to change the port we're listening to. So let's give it a quick go. This is something you can change in when running from Xcode by setting environment variables. So let's set the NIO Swift MUD port to something like 2121. And I think if we now close and run it again, it's running on 2121. Well, at least it's saying it does, so let's give it a go. So it won't be listening to this one anymore, but it will to this one. Cool. So I think this is enough sort of bug fixing. There is one little feature I want to implement, and that's in the look command. I want to see a list of all the other players that are in the room, because now there's absolutely no real way of knowing that a player is already standing in the room. So we have our formatted description, but that's just a room. Let's also get the players in room, or at least the other players in the room, and that will be an await user.filter where the current room ID is equal to the room ID we have here. So then we have all the users that are in the room, but we want to filter on the ID is not the same as our user.id. Otherwise we'll always see, hey, you're here yourself. Then we want to create a string that tells what this looks like. So we'll say something like players, and then we'll add our other players in room. We'll map this to only include the username. So we'll have an array of usernames now, and then we'll join them using a comma and a space, and then we'll add the player string to the room description. Perhaps add a new line in between, and I think we should now be able to also see the other players in the room. So telnet into our system, and we'll log in our test user 1, and we'll look, and we'll see that test user 2 is here as well. So that's an example of a quick new feature we added. So let's talk about a bit more complicated features. So I think concerning features, there are two parts. There is adding additional functionality to the game itself. So for instance, there's not much to do in this game yet. You could even say it's not really a game yet, it's more like a glorified chat room system. So what about features like items and inventories, or doors between rooms, requiring perhaps keys to open? So that's one thing. Another thing would be how do you create your world? We now have more or less have to manually edit this rooms.json file, and I think it is more feasible as long as the amount of rooms remains pretty small. However, I don't think this will scale to more than like a dozen or so rooms. So one thing we could consider is building a sort of editor to help create the rooms and create the connections between the rooms. And that's also where I want to leave you all for today. What is it that you would like to see next going forward with this project? Do you think do you want to see additional functionality implemented? Is this something you want to see improved? Is this just something you want to clone from GitHub and improve yourself, which is very well possible and very much permitted in the license as well. So let me know, basically, where would you like to go from here? And so with that, I say thank you for if you made it to the end of this series. Have a good day, and perhaps we'll see you next time. Bye bye.